Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala Rasulihil Kareem. So in this lesson, we're going through now. We said here that we were discussing the last lesson ta'an, and we said ta'an. One of the ta'an of the rawi was waham, and if he narrates a riwayah with a waham, that's called mu'allal, meaning he assumes he thought something but he made a mistake. And mukhalafa is where he narrates something contrary to the more thiqa ruwat. So in there, we're going to discuss mu'allal, and then we're going to discuss mukhalafa. And within mukhalafa, there's many of them. We're going to discuss mudraj, maqloob, mazid, asanid, tahrif, tasheef. There's many more. We need to add on to this, but we'll go through a few bit by bit, inshallah. Okay? So as a recap, we said we have hadith maqbool and hadith mardud. A hadith mardud can either be mardud because of the saqt in the rawi, in the sanad, the rawi is saqit, or because of a ta'an in the rawi. The saqt can either be zahir, it's apparent, you can clearly see. Once you know birth dates and death dates, you should be able to understand this. You have hadith mursal, you have hadith mu'allaq, hadith mu'adal, and hadith munqati'. Okay, mursal, sahabi is missing. Mu'allaq, from the sanad author, he's missed out many of them, or a few. Mu'adal, two or more continuous. Munqati' is then used, and I said to you, munqati' can use any zahir, or it can be any apart from those. Then we have khafi, we have in there mudallas, or we have mursal khafi. Then we can have ta'an, and in ta'an, we said here, in the ta'an, we can either have the rawi is kadhib, his hadith will be known as mawdu'. The rawi can be accused of kadhib, and we explain what that means, and his hadith will be matruk. The rawi can have fisq, then his hadith will be known as munkar. The rawi can have bid'ah, there's no specific name for this. The rawi can be majhul, we do not know who he is, so we can't perform anything, so we say, well, we don't know who he is, so no accusation against him, we don't know who he is, we can't form a profile about him. Ghafla, he makes, these first five are to do with adala. Then we have ghafla and khata, meaning whether he's taking the notes or whether he's relaying the notes and relaying the hadith, he makes mistakes in those. Those are also known as munkar. If he has waham, then hadith is known as illah. Waham meaning he thinks it's like this, but it's not really like that. He thinks this rawi is missing, but it's not really missing. Or he thinks the rawi has been added, but it's not really added. So those are called illal. Then we have mukhalafa, and then we have su'ul hifz. So now we're going to go through now. What's this thing here? ثُمَّ الْوَهْمُ إِنِ اطُّلِعَ عَلَيْهِ بِالْقَرَائِنِ. Then we have waham. So now he's going to thumma, and then he explains all of a few of the other ones. He says thumma al-bid'ah, thumma al-jahala, and he explains all of these bit by bit, one by one. So waham. Now how do you understand waham? إِنِ اطُّلِعَ عَلَيْهِ بِالْقَرَائِنِ وَجَمْءُ الطُّرُقِ فَالْمُعَلَّلِ. Now let me. So from waham and mukhalafa, what we're talking about now mistakes in the narration. I've never seen anybody do this, but maybe we can do this taqseem to make it easier. So what we can say here is that the same way we have saqt in the riwayah, isn't it? We have saqt, we have saqt. We have saqt, and we said here, saqt zahir and saqt khafi. I think we could also go like this and say what? We can have khata'un and khata'un zahir and khata'un khafi. And in the khata'un zahir is basically, what if you can just compare, like for example, you can just do it simply by comparing narrations. And for this, you have to know history. You have to know biographies, you have to know the ins and outs. So for example, a saqt zahir will be, if we got hadith Ka'b ibn Murrah, and the more authentic narrators say Murrah ibn Ka'b. We compare two asanid, we realize it's a mistake. That's like a mistake that's obvious. And saqt khafi, there's no rules for this. It could be anything not saqt khafi, the khata khafi, it could be anything. He went to this person, but at that time, the sheikh had a bad memory. So you could even, as I gave to you before example, that you could have two thiqa narrators. They're both thiqa, they're both authentic. But it's a small, but you don't take from them. For example, you could have a narrator, for example, Hushaym. I gave this example before. Hushaym is a thiqa narrator. Zuhri is a thiqa narrator. Both are in Sahihain. But nobody ever takes Hushaym narration from Zuhri. Why? Because when Hushaym went to hear from Zuhri, after he heard from Zuhri, all his notes got blown away. That's a khafi. You will never know this. You can't figure this out. You can compare as many chains as you want. You will never know that so you say Hushaym is thiqa, Zuhri is thiqa, Hushaym met Zuhri, sanad muttasil, thiqa rawi. Why don't you take this? You would have to know the story behind of this. So we can say that some uyub and some faults and some mistakes that you get in the hadith, some are zahir and some are khafi. And for the khafi, there's no rules for this. And in zahir, you can understand it from seeing when you compare the chains together. When you compare the chains together, you come to realize, okay, there's a fault in here. So this is proper illah. This is illah, like proper illah khafiyya, very hidden. This is like illah, or I don't know if you want to call it illah, but this is like, you can call it illah, but it's not too deep. You just compare a few asanid and that kind of stuff, and you can figure out, okay, something went wrong here. And the illah khafiyya is khata khafiyya. Is no way you can know this until you know the whole history and you know like all the ins and outs. You following? So if you could keep that in mind, it might kind of give you some kind of perspective of what we're dealing with here. So as I said, no book of Mustalah can discuss this because there's no rules. It's not like a rule of thumb. It's like every narrator, you have to know about that person to find out what's going on. Do you understand? Are you following? Do you get what I'm saying? Everybody following me? Okay, so we've done illah. Now he's going on to mukhalafa. What does mukhalafa mean? You compare two chains and you realize something's gone wrong here. So one of them is mudraj. So adraja yudriju literally means what? Sanastadrijuhum min haythu la ya'lamun. So darj means to, remember we did in Tasif al-Izzi? Fil waqfi wa darj. Darj means to continue, to place one into the other. Idraj, to place one thing into the other. So when you have mudraj, what's happening in mudraj is that you're placing one hadith into another hadith. You're placing one word into another word. So he says here, ثُمَّ الْمُخَالَفَةُ إِنْ كَانَتْ بِتَغْيِيرِ السِّيَاقِ فَمُدْرَجُ الْإِسْنَادِ. So I think in Bayqunia we only done mudraj in matan. We add a word. Remember, I think we done it in Bayqunia. Mudraj of a matan. We added one word in the matan. But أو بدمج موقوف بمرفوع فمدرج المتن. So what we're saying here is when we're adding something, you're merging one into the other. So we've done this in Bayqunia. So basically damj means to mix together. So when you merge a mawquf with a marfu, so you might think somebody narrates it as marfu and they say it's mawquf or mawquf with marfu. This is called mudraj in the matan. So there's a marfu hadith really, but he narrated mawquf, or somebody makes it mawquf in the marfu. Yes? No, sorry, what am I doing here? Sorry. When we say mudratul matan, what we're saying here is that the rawi adds in. So mawquf basically means a statement of what? Who's the mawquf? Of a sahabi. That's or they don't have it here, but you even get people afterwards. Remember, like people, for example, do explain a gharib word. So when you add a word, so you mix or you add in the rawi's word or the narrator's word in the marfu'. Like for example, the hadith we had in the Bukhari hadith, وَكَانَ تَحَنَّثْ وَالتَّعَبُّدْ. So in there the rawi added in the word ta'abbud. So that's mudraj al-matan, where you add a word into the text. And mudraj al-isnad, we'll discuss that bit by bit, is basically when you merge one chain into the other. When we get examples, we'll see. So let's start here. Now here, let's look at example here. So Imam Ahmad rahmatullah alayhi, he's have a chain. He says here, حدثنا محمد بن جعفر قال حدثنا شعبة عن أبي بشر عن رجل من أهل مكة. What's that known as? When you have رجل من أهل مكة, what's this going to be called? Very good, mubham. Okay, so now this is now mubham. An rajulin min ahli Makkah. This is mubham. So what would and we call it mubham, but what does it fall under? What category does it fall under? From our ta'an, where does it fall under? Because mubham wasn't a ta'an, was it? But where does mubham fit under? In our 10 categories to do adala and zabt. Jahala, he's majhul. So this hadith is going to be what? Weak, because we don't know who this person is. Could be anybody. An Abdullah ibn Amrin and Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And then he said, أنه رأى قوما توضأوا لم يتموا الوضوء فقال ويل للأعقاب من النار. So the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, ويل للأعقاب من النار. There's another hadith from Imam Ahmad. And in here he says, حدثنا أبو بشر أن يوسف بن ماهك أن عبد الله بن عمرو. What's happening in here now? We focus on the hadith. What's happening in this one? Who can tell me what's happening in here? Who can give an analysis of this one? Ah, mashallah. Yeah, we can see here, this narration, this other narration, Abu Bishr. So Shu'bah In Shu'bah, he doesn't say the name. So when Shu'bah narrates from Bishr, he doesn't say the name. But when Abu Awana narrates from Bishr, he narrates the name. And the name is Yusuf ibn Mahak, and he's one of the Asatidha. He's Imam Bukhari takes from him. So now the majhul is gone now. The jahala is gone. Okay, that's another masla, but I just point it out to you. Okay, and in here the word of the hadith is wailul lil aqabi minan nar. Wailul lil aqabi minan nar. Meaning, when you do wudu, make sure you wash your heels properly. Don't left your heels. If you leave your heels unwashed in wudu, what will happen? Your wudu won't be counted. Wudu not counted. Salah not counted. So make sure you wash your heels properly. Imam Ahmad rahmatullah alayhi, he has another hadith, and this time this is from Abu Hurairah. Now in this one, Abu Hurairah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, he said, Ahsinul wudu. What did Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu say? Ahsinul wudu'a yarhamkumullah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon you. This is a note. You see here, you have yarhamkumullah. We should try to make this as a habit. For example, I was in some of the like durus from other like places. There's one dars from Madinah Munawwara. They were doing the Muwatta Imam Muhammad. It's a really good habit to have was when the Ustad would correct them, they would say, they would take the mistake and say, Jazakallah, and they would carry on. Ya Ahsanallahu ilayk, and carry on. So whenever they make a mistake, instead of saying yes or okay, they would say Ahsanallahu ilayk. So like even here, Ahsanil wudu yarhamkumullah. So each time they are making dua for each other. So it's a good habit if you can inculcate. It'd be very good. So that each time your students, they get dua from you. So anyways, he says Ahsanil wudu. So in this hadith, what do we have? We have Ahsanul wudu'a. Ahsanul wudu'a. So who's saying Ahsanul wudu? Who's saying this? رأيت أبا هريرة مر بقوم يتوضؤون من مطر فقال أحسن الوضوء. What's this? So that's when we call what? That's mawquf, isn't it? His words, isn't it? And then he says that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, وَيْلٌ لِلْعَقَابِ مِنَ النَّارِ. Then we have another hadith from Imam Ahmad rahmatullah alayhi, and he says here, Abu Hurairah, same thing. And in there he said, what? Asbighul wudu, complete wudu. Ahsanul wudu, asbighul wudu. And he said, Wailul lil aqab min an-nar. Okay, you following? And then we have another hadith from Khatib al-Baghdadi, he narrates it. And in here he says, from Shu'bah, from Muhammad ibn Ziyad, Abu Hurairah, he says here, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أسبغ الوضوء ويل للعقاب من النار. Now obviously there's a lot more. Don't look at one example and try to become muhaddith. There's so many more hadiths you have to do. This field of hadith is very, very complex, loads of information. But even I have a few questions on this, but looking at all the other hadiths, which are not in front of you right now. But anyways, we'll do what the books have told us. And what will you assume, what's happening with asbighul wudu'a based on the information we have here? What do you think asbighul wudu'a is? On all the based on the previous ahadith. So wailul aqab min an-nar, is this marfu or mawquf? That is marfu because all the narrations have this as marfu, isn't it? Yes? But asbighul wudu'a, yeah, it seems that this is mawquf and is added together. So this is now called mudraj. What has he done now? He's added a mawquf statement into a mawquf statement into the marfu'. But fihi kalam that you can have when we do the hadith, maybe inshallah later on, we have kalam on there. But for now, the examples in the books is that you have a mudraj at the beginning of the sanad. Asbighul wudu'a. Yes? So you have a mudraj at the beginning of the sentence. Okay? And then there's an example in Bayquniya. We have a mudraj in the middle of the sentence. Now you shouldn't do mudraj. Mudraj is an aib. But this mudraj, you can tell clearly that this mudraj is not altering the hadith. This mudraj is basically simply doing what? Clarifying the meaning. And he made it clear, qala wa tahannuth at-ta'abbud. Everybody knows not hadith. This is the mudraj. So sometimes this kind of mudraj is okay. But without clarifying and adding in words, that's problematic. So idraj is a problem when it's not clear or it's not pointed out that it's a rawi's opinion or rawi is a mawquf. But when it's very obvious like this, it's not a problem. Do you understand? Okay? Everybody following me? And then another example of mudraj fil matan, we'll do that inshallah. The last example, we'll do that inshallah later on inshallah. Okay? Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil kareem. So in the previous lesson, we were discussing mudraj, and we said mudraj, and we gave an example of mudraj fi ibtida'i sanad. We had a mudraj at the beginning of the sanad. We had a mudraj in the middle of the sanad, and now the example of mudraj at the end of the sanad. We did this by Bayquniya. We'll quickly recap again. So we have a hadith here from Malik and Nafi and Abdullah ibn Umar, and he said that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was on the minbar, and he said, al-yad al-ulya khayrun min al-yad al-sufla, wal-yad al-ulya hiya al-munfiqa, was-sufla as-sa'ila. So in this hadith, what happens here? We have the word wal-yad al-ulya. The upper hand is the one that spends, and the bottom hand is the one that receives, the one that asks. So in this hadith, both of them, there's no differentiation as to whether this is, it seems on the apparent that this second sentence in yellow is also a part of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's kalam. However, if you look in another narration, where it says here, the top narration, in this one, Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan, he wrote to Abdullah ibn Umar that tell me your needs. فَكَتَبَ إِلَيْهِ Abdullah. So in this one, he says here, he quotes the hadith, yes? He quotes the hadith. He quotes the hadith, yes? Correct? So in this one, he quotes the hadith and he says, وَالْيَدُ الْأُلْيَا خَيْرٌ مِنَ الْسُفْلَى. So the red part is in both hadiths. But then at the end, he says, وَإِنِّي لَأَحْسِبُ الْيَدَ الْأُلْيَا الْمُعْتِيَةَ وَالسُّفْلَى السَّائِلَةَ. So in this version of the hadith, he says, and I think, and I consider, I believe that the higher hand is the one that is giving and the lower hand is the one that takes. So in this one, from this hadith, we can understand that this part is part of his ahsibu, not part of his. So even though in this narration, it seems that it comes together, really, when you look at the other hadith, he's saying, I think. So this is what we call mudraj. Correct? Mudraj fil matan. And this mudraj, it comes at the end of the sanad. No, sorry, end of the matan, sorry. So you have mudraj fil sanad and you have mudraj fil matan. We do mudraj fil sanad later on. But the mudraj fil matan, we have three examples. Asbighul wudu, like in beginning of the chain. We have at-ta'abbud, at-tahannuth wa at-ta'abbud, middle of the, I keep on saying chain, middle of the matan, and then we have here, at the end of the matan, we have a mudraj. So we have mudraj can come anywhere. We give three examples just to make it very clear. Are you following? Okay. Now carrying on now, the next one we have is a mudraj fi sanad. And I told you before, mudraj means to make one thing enter into the other. So the same way you make the text, one text enter the other text, you can sometimes have one chain going into the other chain. So here we have a hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. He asked Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Ayyu dhanbi a'zam inda Allah azza wa jal. What is the greatest sin? And you may have done this commentary in Mishkat already. قال أن تجعل لله عز وجل ندا وهو خلقك. Allah created you and you make an opposition, you make a shirk for him. So then, أن تقتل ولدك أن خشيت أن يأكل من طعامك. That you kill your child for fear that he may eat with you. قال ثم قلت, then Abdul Mas'ud said, then what? He said, أن تزاني بحالة جارك. That you commit zina with your neighbor's wife. So zina itself is evil, but your neighbor, someone who trusts you, and then you commit zina in that way, it's even more treacherous. So anyway, this is the hadith. We look at the sanad. So in this sanad we have here, Bukhari narrates, he says, حدثني عثمان بن أبي شيبة قال حدثنا جرير عن منصور عن أبي وائل عن عمرو بن شرحبيل عن عبد الله. Yes, so remember the eldest Abdullah from the companions of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu. So when they say Abdullah, they mean Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu. So from him we have Amr ibn Shurahbil, from him Abu Wa'il, from him Mansur. Yes, that's a chain, yes, follow? Okay. Now, Amr ibn Shurahbil, his name is also, his kunya is Abu Maysara. So you need to know, see, in hadith you need to know names, you need to know kunya. If not, then you might say, for example, next hadith we have here, same one, Mansur and Abi Wa'il, this is Bukhari again, different chain, Mansur, Abi Wa'il, Amr ibn Shurahbil and Abdullah. Correct? So what's happening here? Sufyan is doing the mutaba of Jarir. This is mutaba. Correct? In this one you have the same one here. This one should actually be brought higher. This is actually, we should actually bring this one as number 2. Because they both branch off Jarir, isn't it? Jarir. And from Jarir it goes to Abi Shaiba and it goes to Qutaybah ibn Sa'id. Let me just change that 1 minute. So if you look at this chain again, we have here Mansur. From Mansur you have Jarir. And from Jarir is 2 students. You have Abu Shu'bah, you have, Uthman ibn Abi Shayba, and you have Qutaybah ibn Sa'id. Correct? So now, Uthman and Imam Bukhari's got 2 narrators that narrate this hadith from Jarir. Then Bukhari's got another narrator, he goes through Sufyan. And all of these go through Abi Wa'il, Amr ibn Shurahbil, whose name is Abu Maysara. So far so good, everybody following? Bukhari rahimahullah has also got another chain. Now what happens here? In this chain, he says, Amr ibn Ali, Hadathna Sufyan. So Sufyan narrated it once, from Mansur, and once he narrated it from Mansur and from Sulaiman. Sulaiman is Sulaiman ibn Mahran al-A'mash. He's known as A'mash. So when you have A'mash, his name is Sulaiman ibn Mahran. So Sufyan, when he narrated it to Muhammad ibn Kathir, yes, he narrated it with only Mansur. And when he narrated Yahya, he narrated it with both narrators. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes the teacher may narrate it brief, short, depending on the length of the dars. It had different things that happen. So he has both narrations. And then we have here, in Musnad of Ahmad, we have here, Shu'bah narrates from what? Wasil al-Ahdab an Abi Wa'ilin an Abdullah. Are you following? So far so good? So in this narration you have Wasil, and for Wasil narrates Abu Wa'il. Yes? So far everybody following me? Now in this next chain we have here, Sufyan narrates from Mansur an A'mash an Wasil. Okay, so let's have a look again now. So what we're looking at here is that everything goes through Abu Wa'il. Correct? So Abu Wa'il the Madar of the Sanad. So Abu Wa'il, let's highlight Abu Wa'il. We can see clearly here. We have Abu Wa'il, Abu Wa'il, Abu Wa'il, we have Abu Wa'il, we have Abu Wa'il. Correct? He's a Madar, everything goes through him. Then we have Mansur, 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 and Mansur. So far so good? And then we've got Wasil. Okay? And in this one, we've got Mansur, A'mash, and Wasil. So in total, we have 3 narrators from Abu Wa'il. Mansur, who else? Who's the second narrator from Mansur, from Abu Wa'il? Sulaiman ibn Mahram al-A'mash and Wasil al-Ahdab. So in this narration, what's happening here? In this narration here, we have all 3 together. So in this narration, Sufyan narrates from all 3 of them. Mansur, A'mash, and Wasil. In this one, he's got 2. In this one, he's got 3. And the rest, we've got 1 narration each. 1, 1, 1. You see what's happening here? Everybody following me? Does it make sense to everybody so far? Yes? Okay. And this Abdul Rahman, this Abdul Rahman here, this Abdul Rahman, his name is Abdul Rahman al-Mahdi. He's also one of the very common, very famous muhaddithun. He's the same age as Imam Shafi rahmatullah. So Abdul Rahman al-Mahdi, he was the one who wrote, he asked Imam Shafi rahimahullah, that how do you guys the fuqaha, you derive masail, you have am and you have khas and you have all of these different things that you use. How do you? So Imam Shafi wrote a letter to Abdul Rahman al-Mahdi. And it became known as Imam Shafi's Risala, which is which people say is one of the earliest books of Usul al-Fiqh, meaning method of how to understand text. Okay? So he says he's got all 3 together, Mansur, A'mash, and Wasil. You following? So far so good? Everybody with me? Okay. So if you look at it, we've got Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, we've got Amr ibn Sharahabil, and we've got Abu Wa'il. Correct? So far so good? And either Mansur or Sulaiman ibn A'rash. Now if you look at it, now there's one more thing we need to note here. In all of these hadiths, who do we have? Amr ibn Sharahabil, Amr ibn Sharahabil, Amr ibn Sharahabil, Abi Maysara, who is Amr ibn Sharahabil, and here what do we have? So Wasil, so what's happening here? Wasil, so Mansur and Abu Wa'il, Mansur narrates from whom? In hadith number 1. Who does Mansur narrate from? Abu Wa'il, from Amr ibn Sharahabil. In sanad number 2, who we have? Mansur, Abu Wa'il, Amr ibn Sharahabil, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Sanad number 3, we have Mansur, Abu Wa'il, Amr ibn Sharahabil, and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. In number 4, we have Mansur, Sulaiman, Abu Wa'il, and Amr ibn Sharahabil or Abu Maysara. And in chain number 5, we have Wasil ibn al-Ahdab and Abi Wa'ilin and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. This does not have whom? Amr Sharahabi is missing from here. Sorry, Amr Sharahabi is missing from here. You see? So what do we know from this? That look, Wasil al-Ahdab, when he narrates this hadith, he doesn't have what? Who does he not have? Who's missing from chain number 5? Amr Sharahabi, rahimahumullah. Correct? But when Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi, so now we know that Mansur and Sulaiman or Mansur, they narrate with this extra chain. But Wasil does not. When Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi narrated from, he had all the chains. He had from Mansur, he had from A'mash, and he had from Wasil. Mansur, And he had from A'mash as well, Sulaiman al-A'mash. But when he narrated the Wasil narration, what did he do? The Wasil narration does not have who? Amr Shurahbil. But when he narrated it, he added all three together and he said, Amr Shurahbil. You see what's happening? He's doing idraj, he's mixing two. So, like the same way, in number 4, Imam Bukhari mixed two sanad together by saying Mansur or Sulaiman. Abdul Rahman al-Mahdi, he mixed 3, Mansur, A'mash and Wasil. But the problem is when he mixed Wasil does not go through, does not mention Amr ibn Shurahbil. And in the last one, when he does the Jama' of all in one sanad, he does idraj, he does mudraj. And he adds Amr Shurahbil, whereas in reality, Amr Shurahbil is not mentioned in Wasil's narration. So if you look at it here in this chart, what do we have? We have Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. From him we have Amr Shurahbil, and his kunya is Abu Maysara. From him was Abu Wa'il, and Mansur and Sulaiman ibn Mahran. Then we have Abu Wa'il, and then we have Wasil. When Wasil narrates it, he does not mention Amr Shurahbil, he goes straight to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Are you following? But when Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi, he narrated when Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi, when he narrated it, he mentioned all 3 Mansur, so he mentioned all of these together. Mansur, Sulaiman al-A'mash, and Wasil, and he put all of them with one chain. So he merged 3 chains together. He merged these 2, which have Amr Shurahbil, and he added this one as well. But this one does not have Amr Shurahbil. Do you understand the issue? This is called Mudraj fi Sanad. This is one form of Mudraj fi Sanad. When a narrator has this multiple chains, he has multiple chains, and he merges the chain all together. Like even Imam Bukhari, that's not a problem. But when the chains are different and he merged together, that becomes Mudraj. So if you look at this one here, we will see in this chain, let's erase this, right? Now if you look at, so let's limit them again. We have 1, we have 2, we have 3, we have 4, we have 5, and we have number 6. Now in number 4, Imam Bukhari has mentioned 2 together. When Imam Bukhari mentioned both of them are the same. Because when we look at Mansur, he mentioned both together, Mansur and Sulaiman, and he's merged the chains together. But it's not a problem because they both narrate the same way. And Abdul Rahman al-Mahdi, he merged 3 together, Mansur, A'mash and Wa'il. But Wasil is not the same as these 2. So now he's merged 3 sanads together, but in one of them is different. Now it's called Mudraj fi Sanad, where the Rawi merges 3 multiple asanid in which one sanad is different. That becomes Mudraj fi Sanad. Does that make sense, everybody? Everybody following? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil kareem. So we're discussing Mudraj, and we mentioned the overriding term of Mudraj means to do idkhal of one into another. And we said this type is Idrajul Sanad and Idrajul Matan. So we did Idraj of Matan before. We give a few examples where it comes at the beginning, it comes at the end, it comes in the middle. Now we're moving on to Mudraj fi Sanad. We've done a few examples already. So another example of Mudraj is here. Look, let's look at this hadith first and explain to you what's going on. We have Malik and Abi Zinad and A'raj and Abi Hurairah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And in this hadith we have إياكم والظن فإن الظن أكذب الحديث ولا تحسسوا ولا تجسسوا ولا تنافسوا ولا تحاسدوا ولا تباغضوا ولا تدابروا وكونوا عباد الله إخوانا. You'll either have covered it or you'll cover the meaning of it later on. The question here is the word ولا تنافسوا. If you look at another hadith, Imam Bukhari has a similar hadith, same from Malik, but this narration is from Malik, not from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. It's from the top one is, so it's hadith number 1 and hadith number 2. The one in Muwatta is Abi Zinad in A'raj and Abi Hurairah, and similar words. This one is Malik from Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri from Anas ibn Malik, Anna Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam qala. Now these two have similar meanings. This one have the last part, وَلَا تَبَاغَضُوا وَلَا تَحَاسَدُوا وَلَا تَدَابَرُوا وَكُونُوا عِبَادَ اللَّهِ إِخْوَانًا. And then this part is something different. Understood? So we have 2 narrations, similar wording. Now if you look at the 3rd narration that Khatib has mentioned, he's mentioned here, Malik and Zuhri and Anasin. So this chain is the same, so this chain, number 3 chain, is the same as number 2. But in here you have La tabaghadu, wa la tahasadu, wa la tadabaru. And then we have the word wa la tanafasu. Now the word wa la tanafasu is not actually in the Malik and this tariq. In this tariq, in the Shihab and Anas ibn Malik, the word tanafasu is not in there. The word tanafasu is in the Abu Hurairah version. Yes? But this narration here from Sa'id ibn Abi Maryam from Malik, he has now mixed Imam Malik's two narrations. So one form of mudraj is where you have one shaykh, and in our scenario it's Malik, and his students have merged two of his narrations together, and they have added the word tanafasu from one narration and put it into the other narration. Have you understood what's happening here? So there's also another form of mudraj. Okay? Okay. Okay, another form of mudraj we have here, look at this one. You have Ismail ibn Muhammad al-Talhi. He says, حدثنا ثابت ibn Musa, Abu Yazid, and Sharik. And Al-A'mash, who's A'mash? We should know his name now. His name is what? Sulaiman ibn Mahran al-A'mash. And Nabi Sufyan and Jabirin قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من كثرت صلاته بالليل حسن وجهه بالنهار. Now this is one of those illah you can't understand by mukhalafah, because there's no other contradictory narration. Okay? So Sharik, this is Sharik. He narrates this hadith. Nobody else narrates anything. So apart from Sharik, there's an illah in here. This illah is not identifiable via, you can't compare two chains to find out the illah. If you were to search, if you don't look in the books of ilal or suwalat, where people ask the muhaddithun questions, or look in the books of tarajim, you can't compare two narrations and come to find out there's an illah. The illah is something beyond this. So as I mentioned to you before, when we say we have illah, the two types of illah, we can say ma'lumun bil mukhalafa, some ilal, which you can understand simply by comparing two narrations. And you can have ghayru ma'lumun bil mukhalafa, or ma'lum bi ghayri mukhalafa. That it's not just by comparing, you have to have other sources of information. Now this hadith, depending on how many times you look at the mutun, they all have the same, wherever the hadith is found, there's no, but the thiqat never narrated hadith. Because what happened was, those people, there were other, so when you look in here, Sharik. So if you look at the other narrations here, what happens here, what he says here, that, so Sharik is thiqa, he's thiqa, he's also thiqa, we know this is not problem. But what happened here was, he is a narration, only he narrates his hadith. And from him you have some weak narrators, the di'af, or the du'afa, they narrate from him. None of the fiqh narrate this hadith from Sharik, even though Sharik has many students. Now, if you look in the books of Asma al-Rijal, who were like, not just a books of hadith, but people who do kalam and the ruwa', he says, what's happening here? He says, what happened was, Wallahu alam, that Sharik was narrating a hadith. So he was narrating the hadith. He said, حدثنا الأعمش عن أبي سفيان عن جابر قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. And obviously, you have long dars. Like, it takes long because obviously, like checking the book, like, it may last for an hour, 2 hours, between after Fajr for a long time. So and between the teacher's not gonna like, in between some of the teacher would talk, he would say things. So what the fiqh or what the students of Sharik say was that Thabit ibn Musa ibn Abu Yazid, he was not I don't want to give up anybody, but the extremely sharpest. So what happened was that he's very pious. So what happened was, when Sharik reached, he was narrating, and you could tell, for example, if I'm giving a lesson, you could tell, I'm saying, give me the pen please. That's not part of the notes, is it? I can say, mashallah, it's very hot today. That's not part of the notes. I say, open the door. That's not part of the notes. That's something that I'm saying in the conversation. So what they say was, when he was saying this, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, then what happened was, Sharik said, he looked at Thabit ibn Musa Abu Yazid, and he was saying, mashallah, very pious. But he said, Man kathurat salatuhu bil-layl hasuna wajhuhu bin-nahar. His tone changed, the way he was narrating the hadith changed, and he wasn't narrating a hadith, he was speaking about, he stopped the hadith, he paused the hadith. But Thabit ibn Musa did not understand the hadith, the narration was paused. And what happened was, Sharik was just talking generally, and he was looking at one of the students, some say with Thabit himself, and he was saying, mashallah, you got so much nur on your face. And the way of saying it was, Man kathurat salatuhu bil-layl hasuna wajhuhu bin-nahar. Those who spend the whole night in salah, they could see the nur on their face during the day. And then whatever he said, and he continued the narration. So he paused. This was actually a pause here, and this was not part of the hadith. So if you look at this here, other students. So if you look in the book Al-Kamil of Ibn Adi, so they mention this whole story, and this is where he got, and that's why. And then the biggest students of Thabit ibn Musa Abu Yazid, they narrate it. But if you look in the books, you will never see anybody from Sharik narrator who's a thiqah. So this is one rare form. It doesn't happen often. One rare form of mudraj. Okay. Now, if you go back now, we're going back to mukhalafa. Remember we said if you have illa. So some illa is known by mukhalafa, some is not known, some is known by ghayr mukhalafa. So we have here maqlub. We done maqlub already by quniya. It's a taqdeem or ta'khir. You change the words. Either you change the words or the order of the sanad, or you change the order of the matan. We just already have Ka'b ibn Murrah and Murrah ibn Ka'b mixed up. What's his name? Is his name Ka'b ibn Murrah, Murrah ibn Ka'b. One rawi made a mistake in that. Another example we done by Qunya was what? We have رجل تصدق بصدقة فأخفاها حتى لا تعلم شماله ما تنفق يمينه. That's the sahih. You give your right hand and the left hand doesn't know. But the qalb version is what? What's the qalb version? The mistaken version? لا تعلم يمينه ما تنفق شماله. This is a what? A qalb from the rawi. So we've done that before. No need for kalam in here. Now this is a new term here. What's this called? The new term we're looking at is ثم المخالفة بزيادة راو. Sometimes you have mukhalafa, meaning what? One rawi is narrating from another one rawi, or one rawi is narrating the sanad in one way, and the other narrating another way. So you're comparing two sanad. You look at the mukhalafa. Is one doing it different to the other? Okay. Now you can have mazid fi muttasil asanid. Let me explain it to you briefly. We've done it before off camera. Let's do it again here. So let's say, for example, if you go back to the same example we're discussing in the previous hadith of Mudraj with Abdul Rahman al-Mahdi, and when he had the additional word. So what do we say here? We had Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Okay? So let's go over here. So we said here, we have Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So we have Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We have Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. From him we have Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Correct? Now, what we say here now, we have a narrator from him is what? Amr ibn Shurahbil. Correct? Who's also known as his kunya? Abu Maysara. And from him, narrated from him, we have Abu Wa'il. Correct? We have Abu Wa'il. And from Abu Wa'il, who do we have? Show us by now by heart. Abu Wa'il, who do you have? We have Mansur. We have who? A'mash. And we have whom? Sufyan. Okay? So this is the narration that we have. We also have what? Who's the other one we have? Wa'il. No, Wasil, sorry. We had Wasil. Now, you had that variation in the narrations. Now, the narration that we have, the majority of the people, well, we have one narration, Amr ibn Shurahbil from Abu Wa'il, correct? So it goes down like this, and here. Now, one narration has direct, correct? So, there's two possibilities, logical possibilities. One possibility is that the real hadith is from Abu Wa'il, from Amr Shurahbil, from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu. And the narrators who have narrated it from Abu Wa'il and missed out Amr Shurahbil, that is what? Is saqt. And the narrator is missing. Correct? You following? So the easy possibility is we're saying here, well, this narration is what? Is saqt. Let's change it. This is a saqt. That really, who's missing from this narration? Amr Shurahbil. So this version, the version that goes through Abu Wa'il from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud directly, this son is missing. So this is what? Saqt khafi. Why? Because Abu Wa'il met Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu. He met him and he also met him. Both of them narrate Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. But there's also another possibility. What if the narration is, this is a narration. Abu Wa'il is the one who met Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who heard the hadith from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu. And some narrators got mixed up and they added an additional narrator. That's also possible, isn't it? When we say tadlis, we have here, we say here, we have tadlis is what? You have a shaykh, correct? The shaykh has a student, a rawi, and he's got another rawi, correct? If this rawi narrates from somebody whom he has met, but not heard his hadith from, it's called what? If it goes directly, what's this called? And it says an, what's this called? What's this called? Everybody, come on. What's it called? It's called tadlis. But because he has met him, he has met him in it. He has actually met him. They've actually met. There's liqa between these two. They've met. What if the narration that has the additional route, this is the correct narration? What if this is correct? And this one is what? Mazid. Instead of saqt, what do you have? Mazid. So the sanad is really, this is actually muttasil. This is muttasil. And the rawi above is mazid. You understand? So that's what we're talking about here. If you have فَالْمَزِيدُ فِي مُتَّصِلِ الْأَسْنَادِ, if you add a narrator, because sometimes, you can see here clearly, because if Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Abu Wa'il has heard from him, and Amr Shurahbil has heard from him, both have heard from him. But some narrations he mentions via, so when Abu Wa'il narrates, some of them he narrates via Amr Shurahbil, Abu Maysara, and some of them narrate directly. So the rawi got mistaken out. So one rawi may get mistaken and drop a sanad, drop him in the wrong narration, and one student might get mistaken and add him in where he shouldn't have been in, because they're both possibility, because he's heard directly and indirectly. So if it's a drop, then it's called what? It's a form of tadlis, or it's a saqt khafi, or more saqt khafi, or tadlis. But tadlis that's another issue again. Or it could be what? It could be mazid fi muttasil asanid. That is really muttasil, but they've added in the chain. Yes? Look at it here. Let's take another example. Look at this example here. We have one person here. His name is Busr ibn Ubaidullah. What's his name? Busr ibn Ubaidullah. He passed away in 120 Hijri. And if you look in the Tarajim, he will say Abu Idris al-Khawlani. He is one of the Ahfadhu Ashab, one of his greatest students. Correct? So we know that he has met Abu Idris al-Khawlani. Yes? You following? So we know that Abu Idris al-Khawlani, he's a narrator, and one of his greatest students is Busr ibn Ubaidullah. Understood? Okay. And if we look in the Kutub al-Ashara here is the meaning I'm looking at, the Kutub al-Sitta, Muwatta, Musnad of Ahmad, Ibn Hibban, and I can't remember. There's one book that we use that has a Kutub al-Ashara. Yes? So in those books, if you search for this one, 16 times we have this narration, Busr ibn Ubaidullah, meaning in the 6 books of hadith, you have 16 times you have Busr ibn Ubaidullah, Nabi Idris al-Khawlani. So we know that Busr ibn Ubaidullah narrates from Abu Idris al-Khawlani. Understood? You following? But we also have Busr ibn Ubaidullah also met the Sahabi Wathila ibn Asqa. Yes? You following? Abu Idris passed away in 80 Hijri, and Wasila passed away in 85 Hijri. You see the problem here? Busr ibn Ubaidullah, and they both lived in the same. Abu Idris was in Dimashq. Wathila ibn Asqa passed away in Dimashq. Only 5 years apart. So Busr ibn Ubaidullah, he's one of the great companions of Abu Idris al-Khawlani, but he's also heard from Wathila ibn Asqa directly. You following? And if you look, there's only one narration where Busra narrates from Wathila directly. So you have two, when you see this narration of Busr ibn Ubaidullah. So one possibility is you have Busr, he narrates via Abu Idris. So if you go Busr, he goes through Abu Idris, then it reaches whom? Who does it reach? Wathila. But because he was in a similar era, you can also get Busr from whom? Who can you get? You could get it in it because of the era and the times that you find. Because logically you can find it. So it's not like a munqati, there's actually a possibility. Now when you look at some asanid, we have the hadith, لا تدسوا على القبور ولا تصلي عليها. Don't sit on the graves and don't perform salah facing them. Now if you look at it here, Imam Tirmidhi, he narrates a hadith from Hannad and from Abdullah ibn Mubarak, a great muhaddith, and Abdul Rahman ibn Yazid ibn Jabir, and Busr ibn Ubaidullah, from whom his teacher Abu Idris, from Wathila ibn al-Asqa, he's a tabi'i, sorry, not a sahabi, from Abi Marthad al-Ghanawi, قال Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and had a sanad. You see what's happening here? So in Abdullah ibn Mubarak, his sanad, he goes through what? He takes the route that Busr ibn Ubaidullah heard from his teacher Abu Idris al-Khawlani, because majority of the things he heard from Abu Khawlani from Wathila. You see how Abdullah ibn Mubarak narrated it? Everybody following? However, if you look at another chain, Tirmidhi got another chain. He says here, Ali ibn Juhrin wa Abu Ammar. So again, so if you look at it here, they go through Huwa. They have Abdul Rahman ibn Yazid, they go through here. Okay, so he should be, so if you look at him, he's in green. Yes, he's a narrator. Okay, now Abdullah Mubarak is on one side, and we have here Walid ibn Muslim, and from him we have two, so Walid ibn Muslim. Okay, now when he narrates it, Walid ibn Muslim, how does he narrate it? Abu Idris not mentioned. He narrated directly. Without any in other information, we can't figure out, well, what's the possibility now? What's three possibilities? Possibility number one is both. That maybe Muslim Ubaidullah heard it both ways, and he narrated it both ways. Maybe he heard it from him directly, and then he narrated it to once. He heard it again indirectly via his Ustad Abu Idris, and he heard it. Or possibility number two is what? Possibility number two is what? So A, the option Alif is what? That both narrations. Option B is what? That what? Riwayah number one is Sahih. Correct? And riwayah number two is what? Mudallas. There's a saqt in there. Even though they didn't do it, the earliest, yes, is Mudallas. Option number three was option Jim. Option Jim is what? Hadith number two is what? Sahih. And hadith number one is what? Mazidun fi muttasil asanid. Fahimtum? That's the third. So, now how do we know? We can't figure this out. We have to look at the ulama before. So here, Imam Tirmidhi, he says here, Qala Muhammad. And Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari, that's what he says, his teacher. And Imam Tirmidhi, rahmatullah, is the student of Imam Bukhari. And he has many questions where he asks Imam Bukhari that I don't understand, not understand meaning, this is the issue, is there illah here, what's the problem? So he says here, so Imam Bukhari rahmatullah says, وَحَدِيثُ ابْنُ الْمُبَارَكِ خَطَأٌ. It's an error. He's saying here, Imam Bukhari is saying that Abdullah Mubarak made a mistake. He says, أَخْتَأَ فِيهِ الْمُبَارَكِ وَزَادَ فِيهِ أَنْ إِدْرِيسَ and Abi Idris al-Khawri. He's actually added in this word here. So he's saying that Abdullah Mubarak, he done, this is Imam Bukhari's opinion, he done as Mazid fi muttasil asanid. Innama huwa Busr ibn Ubaidullah and Wathila directly. And then he says here, Hakadha rawa ghayru wahid Abdul Rahman ibn Yazid. This is our Madar Sanad. Abdul Rahman ibn Yazid ibn Jabir. So if you go back to the previous one, the narrator from Busr ibn Ubaidullah is Abdul Rahman ibn Yazid ibn Jabirin. From here you have Abu al-Walid, you have other people. He's saying here, ghayru wahid, more than one people. They've all narrated it from Abdul Rahman ibn Yazid, and their narration do not have Busr ibn does not have Abu Idris al-Khawlani. وَلَيْسَ فِيهِ أَنَّ أَبِي. All of these people, ghayru wahid, all of them. So what he's done here now, this is what, so what do we say here? The riwayah of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Abdullah ibn Mubarak is what? What is it going to be? He's a thiqah narrator, narrating contrary to thiqat. So what is it going to be? Is it going to be what? Very good. Is it going to be shadh? This is going to be shadh. And we say it's going to be mahfuz. Not mahfuz. Huh? Ji? Huh? The second reason Imam Bukhari gave. He's not giving another reason. He just saying here, this is a statement. This is the fact. This is the masala. This is the fatwa. This is the fatwa. This is the jawab. This is the reason. This is the reason. The reason. So in the first part, he's just saying this is right, this is wrong. He just said it blank. Why? He's saying here the reason. غير واحد. So Abdul Rahman ibn Yazid, you have multiple narrators. So one thiqa rawi, Abdullah ibn Mubarak, is narrating one thing in one way, and the other narrators who are more in number, they're narrating the other way. So he's then preference over kathratu thiqat over thiqa wahid. Yes, and then at the end he says, well, also note that it is possible. Busr ibn Ubaidullah, قَدْ سَمِعَ مِنْ وَاثِلَ ibn Asqa. He did hear. So it's not munqati. It's not that everybody narrated munqati. It's actually mazid fi muttasil azhanid. Do you understand? So we say here, so if you look at it here, when we have, so if you look at it here, if you go ahead, we can say we have illa, we have an illa, correct? What does illa mean? A defect in the hadith, even though the riwayat are thiqa, even everything is in place, the riwayat is thiqa, the sanasin, muttasil, the zahir is fine, but there's a defect. This defect, you can say two types of defect. One is ma'lumun bil mukhalafa. What do? When you compare asanid, you come to know that what? There's a issue. And the other is ma'lumun bi ghayri mukhalafa. Just by comparing, you can't come to the conclusion, you can't understand. And the mudraj of Sharik, of Thabit from Sharik, that was an example of that. Just by comparing sanad, you can't figure out what's going on. And ma'lum bil mukhalafa is this example here. When you have ma'lum bil mukhalafa, the ones that are rajih, what do you call those? The ones that are rajih, what do you call them? You call them mahfuz and, what's opposite of mahfuz? Shadh, correct. And ma'ruf and munkar. And if you can't figure out, what's it called? Mustarib. And then each mukhalaf has a particular name. When one narrator narrates different to the other narrator, each of these has a different name. What's the different name of each of these? You can have qalb, you can have what? Mazid, you can have mudraj. Yes? So you have illah, which is known by mukhalafa, and then you have to choose which one. You can either choose give tarjih to one of them. You have mahfuz, shaz, ma'ruf, munkar, or if you can't give tarjih, you have mustarib. And then some illah have their own reason, have their own name. You have qalb, you have mazid, you have mudraj, you have a different one. And then you have some illah which you can't understand by comparing. You have to understand it by knowing more information. Those are called what? There's also called hadith ma'lul, but we don't have a particular name. It is said because there's too many variations. So some of them have a name. For example, that mudraj of Sharik, of Thabit, that has a particular name, mudraj. But some of them, they don't have particular names. Do you understand how it's working, how it's fitting together? Okay, inshallah, we'll continue in the next lesson, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Subhanallah wa bihamdik, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, wa nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil kareem. So, we're moving on to another type of mukhalafa, and this is called musahhaf or muharraf. What does this mean? Basically, there's an error usually in writing. If you get an error in the dots, or you get an error in the harf. So for example, if somebody says here, for example, the nuqat, for example, if you say here, he writes that. Now, what's this going to be? It should be Anas. Somebody narrated this. Obviously, I don't know how true it is, but like a joke. Somebody has a real like a thing. So instead of saying Anas, he said what? So I have Anas Hamza. So he said it. He narrated it as what? Atash. And there's another one, for example. There's a hadith. He says here. So it was using like this. So that the person read it as, one option is what? You can say idh. One option is idh habu anna. Go away from us. But the actual wording is what? Id da hi nu ghibban. Put oil on sometimes. Don't keep on obsessed with your oil. So he said, the Prophet said, idhabu anna, go away from us. And it's really supposed to be iddahinu ghibban. So if you make a mistake in the letters, the dots, so if you make a letters in the dots, it's called musahhaf. And if you make a mistake in the shakal, meaning like a dal and a ra, or a dal and so if you make a mistake in the huruf, that's called muharraf. The harf has been like changed. And musahhaf is what you call changing the nuqat. So these are kind of obvious mistakes. You want to get any technical mistakes like this in books of hadith, some really, really obvious ones are in other books you'll find. Okay? Next thing he's mentioning here is, it's not necessarily mukhalafa, but what he's saying here, what he's saying here, that, you will find a mukhalafa. Why? When there's riwayat bil ma'na. Because you can see that they're narrating the same thing, but they're doing riwayat bil ma'na. So he's saying here, وَلَا يَجُوزُ تَعَمُّدُ تَغْيِيرِ الْمَتْنِ بِالنَّقْصِ وَالْمُرَادِفِ. It is not permissible to ammud intentionally. It is not permissible to intentionally change the matan by shortening it, or muradif by adding synonyms. It is not permissible to intentionally change the matan by shortening it or by adding muradif. Why? Because obviously you change the words. إِلَّا لِعَالِمٍ بِمَا يُحِيلُ الْمَعَانِ. Unless there is a scholar who is faqih, who understands the implications and the ma'ani. That when you change the words, what meaning difference will occur? So ideally, you may have two narrations. One is the original wording, and one is riwayat bil ma'na. They narrated the meaning, not necessarily the exact words. So what he's saying is that ideally, it is not permissible to narrate something bil ma'na. You have to do the same words wherever possible. And this will probably apply to the later scholars, not the earlier scholars, because the earlier scholars used to do it, and the rules of hadith came out later on. So they would do riwayat bil ma'na sometimes. But it's only permissible if you understand the meaning. If you don't understand the meaning, somebody's not got a fiqh, understanding, proper understanding what's being said. For him to change the words, he might not understand the implication of changing the word. So he should not change the word. So ideally, you want to have riwayat bil love. But you do get riwayat bil ma'na sometimes, and the ulama have differed, is it permissible, not permissible? So ideally, you get riwayat bil love, but riwayat bil ma'na is also permissible. So you can get a mukhalafa which occurs because of riwayat bil ma'na. So somebody's narrated the meaning and slight change because of the same similar words. It doesn't change the meaning, but it changes the wording. But the meaning is the same. Okay? Are you following? So far, so good? So a question here is that what's the difference between musahaf and muharraf and muftariq and muttafiq? So in muttafiq and muftariq is that the words are written the same. They're actually written the same, but they denote different people. And in mu'talif and mukhtalif, it's written similarly, but they have different things. There's no mistake in there. And in musahaf and muharraf is, he's made a mistake in writing. Yes? So in muttafiq and muftariq, or mu'talif and mukhtalif, is that they're written similarly or the same, but they mean different things. They spell correctly. They have different meanings. And in musahaf and muharraf, what's happening here is actually an error. You understand the difference between them? Yes? Okay. Now what he's saying here at the end, فَإِنْ خَفِيَ الْمَعْنَى. If you have a word, or you have, the meaning is complex, the meaning is hard to understand. Two possibilities. Possibility number one is what? There's a single word. There's a single word which is hard to comprehend. Correct? And the second possibility is the overall meaning is difficult to understand. So for example, you might have a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, فَإِنَّهُ لَهُ وِجَاء فَإِنَّهُ لَهُ وِجَاء. So what does wija mean? It's not a common word. So now what do you need here? It's called ghareebul hadith. Remember, ghareeb means strange. So this ghareeb doesn't mean in terms of number of narrators. The ghareebul hadith means there's one word in the matan, we don't know what it means. Are you following? And the overall meaning is I don't get it. Is it contradictory? Is it things? Then you have mushkil, bayan al-mushkil, where ulama have explained the overall meaning, the contradictions or the apparent contradictions. Have you understood? Are you following? Yes? So it says here, فَإِنْ خَفِيَ الْمَعْنَى. If the meaning is what? Hidden. The meaning is obscure, difficult. احتيج إلى شرح الغريب. You will need to explain that one word which is difficult to understand, or is like basically a dictionary of hadith, basically. And bayan al-mushkil is when more often is holistically the hadith is hard to understand because of certain difficult contradictions or discrepancies, etc. Understood? So this is the end of the mukhalafa section that we've discussed. Okay, so tomorrow inshallah we'll summarize it and we'll go through some examples inshallah. Okay, subhanallah wa bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, wa nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, wa nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Okay, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. So before we move on, let me just explain one thing here. So what we mentioned yesterday is regarding the meaning of a word. If we have a a difficult word. Okay? A difficult word which is not easily understandable. You can call this what? Gharib. A gharib word or a mushkil word. Okay? Ashkala meaning it's mixed in the shahamsh, in the same, have the same shakl. So sometimes what happens is that this comes within the hadith, within the matan. So a rawi is adding the explanation of the word within the matan. This is called mudraj. Are you following? It's called mudraj. And this is, if it's not very clear, it's a problem. If it's very clear, وَهُوَ التَّعَبُّدْ, you can very easily say, وَقَالَ, you explain that. That's not too much of an issue. What we're seeing here, that sometimes, but not sometimes, some words may have been known by the Sahaba, the Tabi'un, very common, but people like us, we don't know what it means. Then the ulama have written books on a particular topic called Gharib al-Hadith. And what do? They now write separate books, commentaries, explaining the meaning of these words. So a difficult word can be explained two ways. The Rawi explains it within the matan itself, that's called a mudraj. And then you have ulama, 100 years, 200, 300, 400, 500, even 1,000 years later. What did they do? Then they write books of Gharib al-Hadith to say, well, let me compile a dictionary of the difficult words of the Quran. And in those we have Al-Fa'iq of Zamakhshari. So this is not a hadith book, it's a basic dictionary. But instead of having all the words, he only works on the words of the hadith, of hadith. You have Al-Fa'iq of Zamakhshari, you have Majma'u Bihar al-Anwar, Majma'u Bihar al-Anwar. You have An-Nihaya fil, An-Nihaya. These are three common ones. Maybe there are probably others as well, but there are three common ones. Do you understand what I'm saying here? So you have a difficult word, difficult to comprehend, the meaning is not clear. So when we mention mudraj is where the rawi, one of the early rawis, the tabi'in, tabi, one of the earliest scholars, they explain it. This is a mudraj. This is where we discuss in, like within the actual text itself. And these are like basically on the side note, different books where you can find the meaning of the hadith. Does that clarify your question? Okay. Anything else? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulil kareem. So moving on now, we're explaining here al-mustarib. So he says, أو بإبداله. So what he said, sometimes you can have a mukhalafa where they change a rawi. So for example, a very simple example, obviously what happens, for example, you have Malik and Nafi and Ibn Umar. So instead of Malik and Nafi, you have Malik and somebody else, for example, you change it. So then, that becomes, that's called ibdal. Now here he says, وَلَا مُرَجِّحَ فَالْمُسْتَرِبْ. This is bit, this la murajjiha is not necessarily linked to the ibdal, it's linked to everything. So we can just pause on this one here for now, and we'll explain it at the end in the summary. وَقَدْ يَقَعُ الْإِبْدَالُ عَمْدًا امْتِحَانًا. So you can't do that. You can't change the rawi. But what he's saying here, all of you have already read a story in Al-Muntakhabat regarding Fadl ibn Dukayn, where what did he do? People try to test him. So sometimes people do this on purpose just to check a person's credibility. Because for example, what they would do, some people were weak in hadith. What they would do, for example, I don't know, like they would try to test them and narrate some stuff from that person, which is not his. For example, you would come to me and say, well, okay, these are the hadiths that you have, let me read it to you, you can affirm it. And what would happen, it was that they would read something and they would add a hadith, and I would say, if I could tell, no, that's not in my copy, I haven't read a hadith, then it's okay, yeah, he knows what he's doing. And if he just says yes, even if it's not his hadith, people add a hadith, people change the narration just to check, is my copy actually correct, or just like, am I actually aware of what I'm doing? So they would do that imtihanan, they would actually change the narration, change the things to test the riwayat, test the ruwat. Look, the shaykh, does he have proper dhabt or not? So sometimes you have ibdal, قد يقع الإبدال عمدا. Sometimes people do it on purpose to test the shaykh, that is his riwayah of the high caliber or not. Understood? Are you following? Yeah? Okay. Okay. So let's just summarize what we have here now. What are we saying here? We can have mukhalafa. So when we look at mukhalafa, we have to look at two different things. One is the types of mukhalafa. Okay? So the mukhalafa can be mudraj fi matan, mudraj fi sanad. You can have maqloob fi taqdeem wa ta'khir. You can have mazid fi muttasil asanid. And then you can have tahrif, and you can also have tasheef. But those are not very common, like in the major books. These are the main things. You have mudraj and you have maqloob and mazid. So when you compare two narrations, you can have their variations. And you have 5 names for specific types of variations. Are you following me? You get it? So 5 types of variations or differences in narrations. So 5 types of differences are mentioned. You have a name for tahrif, a tasheef, a mudraj, a maqloob. You may also get other types of variations, or where 2 narrators narrate the same hadith, or one narrates different than the other one. Okay? But these are not normally common terms they would use. Now, what happens now? When you have the mukhalafa, is that, for example, you have the mukhalafa. Now, how do we analyze the mukhalafa? Which one do we give preference to? You see, so there's 2 aspects of mukhalafa. The type of mukhalafa, maqloob, mazid, idraj, qalb. You following? That's one way. What type of mukhalafa? The other one is, okay, in this mukhalafa, who do we give preference to? Then we have the 4 names. We have mahfuz, we have shadh, we have ma'ruf, we have munkar. And then, if you can't make a decision, it becomes mustarib. Do you understand how this mukhalafa works? So one is the type of mukhalafa. Then you have a name. Where's the ikhtilaf in? Is it in adding a word, subtracting a word? That's called mudraj. Is it in the order of the hadith? That's qalb. Is it adding a narrator? Mazid fi mutas asanid. This all becomes what? This is all what? A type of, this is a type of mukhalafa. Then in that mukhalafa, who do we give preference to? Then we have the other 5 names, mahfuz, shadh, ma'ruf and munkar. And if you can't come to a conclusion, you call it mustarib. Do you understand? And then the mahfuz is what? When a thiqa narrates something, mahfuz is the awthaq, or the narration of the awthaq, or narration of the thiqat, compared to the shadh, which is what? Only one thiqa by himself. Correct? And in ma'ruf, is when you have a saduq or a khafif al-dhabt, and his opposite is what? Another is a khafif al-dhabt, somebody who's like slightly weak or very weak. So then you have a ma'ruf, and the other is called munkar. And if you can't come to a conclusion, then it becomes what? Mustarib. Do you understand? So this is a summary of G. Saduq is basically khafif al-dhabt. That's another word, another name used for khafif al-dhabt. Yeah, who's honest, but his dhabt is not at the highest level. Okay? Understood? Everybody following? Okay. Subhanallah wa bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, wa nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.